you read us out of closed session, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the board and public. The board met in closed session and heard from Authority Council on items 4A and 4B, the two pending litigation items. That is Keep Fort Ord Wild versus Fort Ord Reese Authority and Marina Community Partners versus Fort Ord Reese Authority. Council updated the board on the status of the litigation, and there's nothing to report out on either of those two matters. 4C, conference with legal counsel, potential litigation. The board heard from counsel and gave specific direction to counsel, and there's nothing specifically to report other than there has been direction given. Item 4D, conference with real property negotiators. Nothing to report out on that matter. And on 4E, public employment, the executive officer evaluation. The board accepted the evaluation, and there's nothing specifically to report.
Thank you. Since we have a lot of new folks here that weren't here when we talked about it, the Friday, September 14th board meeting has been moved to September 28th. September 28th for the September meeting. Okay. Also, the Seaside building removal kickoff will be September 5th in the city of Seaside at 11 a.m. Do we have a location?
It'll be on the site.
Oh, on site at Surplus 2.
140 Colonel Durham.
140.
140 Colonel Durham Road.
Okay, 140 Colonel Durham Road. Got it. Okay. So we'll move on to roll call, please.
Supervisor Parker. Here. Supervisor Phillips. Here. Supervisor Adams. Here. Mayor Edelin. Here. Councilmember O'Connell. Here. Councilmember Morton. Here. Councilmember Hoffa. Here. Mayor Rubio.
Here.
Councilmember Alexander.
Here.
Mayor Carbone. Here. Mayor Gunter.
Here.
Councilmember Garfield.
Here.
Councilmember Reimers.
Here.
Kathleen Lee. Nicole Hollingsworth. Erica Parker. Debbie Hale. Dr. Diffenbach. Steve Matarazzo. Andre Lewis. Colonel Ford. Bill Collins. Dr. Triblee. Lisa Reinheimer. Dr. Moore. You have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is a consent agenda, which consists of A, approved July 13, 2018 meeting minutes, the Administrative Committee report, Veterans Issues Advisory Committee report, Prevailing Wage Status report, Fiscal Year 2017-18 Annual Report, F, Transition Planning Process Update, and G, a public correspondence to the board. Is there any item that would be any board member would like to pull for further consideration? F. A. Okay. We've had a request that if item F was pulled, that we put it on the business items as item 8F. So we'll do that. Item A.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a small correction. My name should be listed as an attendee.
Thank you. Is there anybody in the public wishing to pull any item? Any public comment on the consent agenda?
Yeah, in regards to moving item 7F to the end of the day, there's a lot of people from the public would probably like to say something, which might, some of you might want to hear and some of you may not want to hear. You know, these meetings are crazy enough as it is, and I would hope that you would reconsider and at least take it up in its appropriate spot, so we don't have to sit here through your insanity. And we can make our comments and then go home.
I usually take up those items as at the consent agenda, but I was asked specifically by a board member that's not here to move it to 8F. So I will go ahead and take it right now. But let's have a motion on the remainder of the consent agenda first.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda with the A correction to the minutes minus item 7F. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Okay, 7F, transition planning process update. Was there?
Well,
Yeah.
yes, Chair, this is an information item. There's no action required of the board. The idea was to give the board staff's conceptual review of what the policy related and specifically related assignments would be, putting it in the form of a resolution that would provide the board members with our perspective on the issues that have to be confronted. Sherry Damon may want to add something with respect to the overview of the item.
Yes, members of the board, members of the public, Sherry Damon. Because I suspected this might have happened, I was hopeful not to give a public presentation because every time I present on transition plan items, it takes, 45 minutes to 3 hours. So I did prepare a PowerPoint for you, but I got great news for you. It's 6 slides. Maybe. There you go. Executive summary, nice pictures of Fort Ord. So the overview of this staff report is a presentation to the board of what's new, what's happened since July 13th, and it's a draft resolution approving a transition plan. And that is the intent of the resolution. The draft resolution makes assignments, makes findings, and does certain things. So what's new? Well, what's new is your staff has been meeting with the county staff, the City of Seaside staff, City of Monterey's staff. We've had some conversations, telephone calls with the LAFCO, obviously not resolving every issue we have out there, but definitely conversations. We have received some public comment. You do have in your packet, and I believe it was distributed to all the board members, a memorandum from your local agency formation commission on their view of the draft resolution. So we will be meeting with them after this meeting to talk with them about that and more specific things. We have the financial report, which was produced by the Economic Planning Systems. Some of that information was already provided to the Transition Adhoc Committee, basically all the CFD information and projections and tables. But there's also the nexus analysis that's a part of that report and a property tax analysis that's part of that report. And finally, the draft resolution approving a transition plan. So this is the anatomy of your draft resolution. It has background and facts. It has some findings. What are the base-wide costs? What is it that we are allocating and where can we find those? What is it that we want to finish? The assignments of administrative liabilities and obligations, and the contractual assignments and obligations. There are some specific subject matter findings and the intent of this board, the majority of this board, how it intends the transition plan subject matter items to work. And if there's anything that it wishes to seek, like legislation, we've tried to capture that gently. It's in draft form. It's subject to the majority of this board's direction to staff ultimately, but we've tried to capture that to help provide intent language in case there's a question about what this board intends as its transition plan. There's a CEQA finding, and finally, there's a request to LAFCO that if there are any changes in the LAFCO process, that this board would be the final arbiter of whatever those adjustments are if this board is still impaneled. So as long as there's a decision before June 30th, 2020, any revisions to your transition plan would come back to this board during the LAFCO process as an iteration. this is not addressed, but this is something we are working on future items and things that will happen after your transition plan is completed, and maybe even in the nearer future, drafting conditions of approval for LAFCO, like, for example, the habitat management area. There's been a suggestion that a joint powers agency is formed, and I have said repeatedly, like, LAFCO can't designate a successor joint powers agency to handle habitat obligations unless it's in existence at the time of formation. But what it might be able to do is craft a condition of approval that says the successor agency is as identified in the chart, unless there is a joint powers agency formed by some or all of those jurisdictions on or before June 30th, 2020, so that there's a process and a way for LAFCO to allow the JPA, but also approve something that has a designation. So that's what I mean by conditions of approval, things that could happen as part of the LAFCO process. And that yet needs to be discussed with LAFCO staff to see what is in the realm of possibility there. Modifications to the contract sheets. We expect to refine those, and we would hope that the jurisdictions would be contacting us to give us specific input as to some of those contractual obligations and the assignments that are in the sheets. We have not received that level of feedback yet. We know the county staff is going through that process of looking at the contracts, the obligations, the subject matters. So we're hopeful to get specific input from all of the staff from the agencies that have assignments. Any amendments to the resolution created by that. And then finally, there's a to-do list post approval of the transition plan, getting the notice of the assignments drafted, the consents to assignments drafted. There's a whole bunch of to-dos, if you will, to implement whatever the final transition plan is. So those are some future action items to come. The first three are prior to your approval of the transition plan in September or October, whatever month that happens to come forward, or November, but prior to December. And then the to-do list is implementing actions. What happens after the plan has been approved, and how do we go forward and do it? And then just a reminder to everyone, please provide questions, comments on the transition plan, specifically to planning@fora.org. That would be greatly appreciated. And to date, I have not received one email at planning@fora.org on the transition plan.
Okay. Any questions from the board? Ms. Morton?
So, Sherry, I'm looking at the resolution. So I get that the action item says it's an information, but attached to this is a draft resolution that sets forth the synopsis of a transition plan. Am I reading this correctly?
Yes. So what this is this is your first look at staff's vision of how this board would approve the transition plan. And it would be done through a resolution type with the assignments as part of it.
So what I'm concerned about is this draft, that there have been no findings made. We've had 2 workshops, but we've never gotten to the discussion of the resolution of the issues at a full board. It's just been informative workshops, but yet we have findings. That concerns me. And then when you went through the staff of whose cities you've talked with, the county, Seaside, you went through a list. Marina was never mentioned as being one. And I have concerns also that this draft at paragraph B regarding roads, top of page 6, that we're stating that it remains in the obligations of a modified extension of the FORA Act as being part of the transition plan for the extension of FORA. And then again in paragraph D, building removal, again, there is that it's a recommendation, a finding that it's a recommendation for the FORA Act to continue. So I'm concerned that this is making a representation to the public that we have somehow come to these conclusions when you're setting them forth, but they're really staff's recommendations of findings.
Actually, this is let me be perfectly clear. I thought I was perfectly clear. This is a draft resolution. I am waiting for board input and direction as to finalizing this resolution. And I don't know that these are the findings this board will make. This is a sample of how findings that you might want to make, or the majority might want to make.
So I get that the majority is making the decision, but the transition plan is if FORA sunsets, and you have the extension of FORA in your proposed draft. So maybe this would be more accurately labeled as a sample.
I labeled it as a draft for the reason that it is a draft. It is not really a sample. It is a draft, and it is subject to revision and modification at the direction of the board. So it is a draft. It's not intended to be the final at this point, and it won't be final until this board takes action on it.
So today we're just, what's asked today is just that we all acknowledge we've received it. And the information you just presented today.
It's just for your information at this point. Yeah. If you do have specific comments or questions or clarifications, or you think something should be handled differently, I would love to have a conversation about that and put it into the hopper of, the process of getting to a final transition plan. But it is intended that this resolution is a combination of two things. It is the findings that the majority of the board would make and a statement of the intent of what this board is trying to accomplish. And it is the second part. It is also the adoption of a transition plan, that by these findings and assignments, that is the transition plan. And it might be that there needs to be a third piece in here on more specific as to implementation of the plan. But the idea here is you have findings that the board makes, you have assignments and approval of allocation of assets, liabilities, pledges, obligations, and you have the CEQA findings, and then you have the statement of intent. Think of it as legislative intent, how this board intends the plan to work.
I think it would probably be appropriate if instead of having conversations, that any input be done in writing, so that when we bring this back to the board, we can peruse the written documents of suggestions, so that we have some sort of record to be able to make decisions on. Ms. Adams.
I understand your comment, but I hope that doesn't stop dialogue at this point.
No.
And what troubles me about this, and I am troubled by it, is that this isn't what the transition task force had agreed to. And I appreciate the fact that it is the board's final decision. I understand that. But simply putting this forward as a draft and having it on paper, I believe that this stands a very good chance of being circulated. And should it become so, I think then people will assume that this is the direction of the board, the transition task force, and then the board as well, even though it clearly says draft. Because if something is a draft, it generally indicates this is where we're going to go. I feel very uncomfortable with agreeing to this in the form that it is. I don't think that this is representative, and I think trying to say that this is the way the board is going to vote, I think is really a bit overreaching. So I'm uncomfortable with it, and I'm not sure what we should do about it at this point, but I do not believe that it represents the work of the transition task force at this point.
Okay, Mr. Hoffa, and then Mr. Eden.
So I have a comment and a recommendation to people in the viewing audience who may be interested in this. The first page of this agenda item, under the first bullet point, provides a link to essentially an economic analysis of FORA sunset and how that will affect the region, how it will affect financially different land use jurisdictions. That's called the EPS memorandum, and that's an independent contractor that did this analysis. it basically confirms what we've been hearing, which is there's going to be a $72 million loss to the region for base reuse mitigation. And for my city, it's going to be a very significant, in the millions of dollars. So I would really encourage people to take a look at that, because there is going to be a significant financial cost to FORA sunset in 2020. Thank you.
Mr. Eagle.
The FORA Transition Task Force and the Adhoc Committee have done a lot of work. I mean, many hours put together, and the comments were made earlier are valid comments. And it's not that you're saying it's nefarious. It's not nefarious, but I and others have gone to the staff and said, look, we've been going back and forth. It seems like we can't get any agreement at all. We're talking about this. We're talking about that. We're going all over the map with regard to ESCA, with regard to the HCP and everything else. There's nothing been put down in writing as to where we want to go. We're running out of time right now, and I think what FORA staff is saying is, look, we're trying to pull all this stuff together. Here's a straw man. Take a look at it. Rip it apart. Let's try and find what we can agree on. We'll get back together and discuss something we agree on. We can't start discussions unless we've got something in paper that says either A or B or whatever, where we can agree or disagree or agree to disagree. But right now, everything from the Transition Task Force and the Adhoc Committee, a lot of discussion, but not much agreement on anything other than going off in different directions and discussing generics. So I think this is a good start. There's a lot I don't agree on here also, and I think we all disagree with a lot of that's going on, but let's take this, rip it apart, bring it back, and see where we can find common ground. At least we have something to start with, rather than, what we've been doing up to this point, doing a lot of talking without producing very much.
And it's already out in the public. I mean, it's part of the published agenda. So I would caution the public not to rush to judgment on this document. It is a draft. It is a starting point for the board to start having substantive discussion on each of these items. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to hear from the public. Sounds like they may have something to say, but as a practical kind of procedural matter at this point, with the concerns about confusion and what's going on that have been raised, it seems like it would be a prudent thing today to not take any official action on this, but just allow this to be received information, so that it's clearer that the board has taken no action, and just not even vote to receive, just allow it to be an informational item and move on with the rest of the agenda.
That's fine. Okay, let me go ahead and, I'm sorry, Ms. Schreiner.
I just have a question. Will we have an opportunity to speak after the others have spoken? I can save my comments for after I've heard, or I just want to be sure. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Schreiner.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to be late, and I appreciate the comments of Supervisor Parker. I'm speaking for the Marina Coast Water District this afternoon. The item on page 6 under water and wastewater, I spoke to the general manager briefly yesterday. He said he has not been contacted by anyone to clarify this. So it looks like there are some question marks and some blanks, but it would seem to me appropriate to contact the Water District General Manager, Keith Vandermarten. I'm sorry he could not make it today, but he told me by telephone yesterday afternoon he had not been contacted. He's very close to having a good draft for Seaside and then Marina on what we call a service agreement that could clarify a great deal of the transition around the water questions. So I would urge you, if you have questions today, I'd be happy to hear them, take note, pass them to Keith Vandermarten, or contact him directly. He's very approachable, and we'd love to have the district work with the land use jurisdictions in order to do things like preserve the water allocations into perpetuity rather than leaving it as a question mark. So this is a time for Seaside or Marina to contact Marina Coast Water District General Manager and try to work on a service agreement, like you said, on paper, something on paper. They have it on paper. The staff has it on paper. So you can start working out some of the details, but it's going to take a little bit of communication. Thank you.
Okay, let me go ahead and open this to the public. Public comment is now open.
Ron Cheshire, Monterey Santa Cruz Building Construction Trades Council. I'm a construction worker, and I'm not confused here in regards to basically what trying to expedite the process a little bit because things seem to always get held up. And maybe that's some of the method to the madness. We do have an election coming up here soon, and, you know, a couple seats on this board could change, and gee whiz, how do you like that? But that's politics, and we can live with that. We do have concerns in regards to the draft, and I will say that one of our concerns, and we haven't made an ultimate decision yet as the Building Trades Council, but FORA as an entity has done very much, very, very much, and helped facilitate the development that has taken place. And there have been some big recipients of that, one jurisdiction in particular. And to not have the expertise in such a FORA is a major concern of ours. So, I mean, whether it's a FORA light or whatever, you know, we'll present our information and that's it. So, you know, giving somebody a 50-yard head start in a 100-mile race, even I could beat Michael in that scenario, okay? Okay, so the last thing is in regards to 3G, in regards to policies. Obviously, we're very concerned in regards to carrying forward the promise of FORA that local development, local workers would have an opportunity, local businesses and such, and that prevailing wage would be maintained to level the playing field, not to give an advantage to anyone on the inside or the outside. And there are a lot of outsiders that are here. And that workers could share in what's taken place, and that local jurisdictions would assume their responsibility as they have not, and that if the state needs to be called in, that's a whole other issue, okay? So we have some points that we will, actually you have a letter from us, but that's just the beginning, and I hope you continue to do this work and get something done prior to midnight, December 30th, after the election, when there's a possibility of seats changing here and such. Thank you.
Any other public comment?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Serrano. I'm one of the senior analysts for the Local Agency Formation Commission. As you're aware, under state law, LAFCO is required to dissolve FORA as part of the 2020 sunset date. We have been in discussion with staff these last couple of years, and more recently in a series of meetings since January. Now, the draft resolution in the attached staff report today includes specific requests for LAFCO to impose responsibilities and assign obligations outside the transition plan that hasn't been adopted yet. And it's unclear whether LAFCO can impose such conditions to outside a transition plan or to entities that are outside LAFCO's purview, such as TAMSI. That is why it's imperative that the transition plan adopted by this board be thorough and comprehensive and have these type of conditions and designations within the transition plan before it's submitted to LAFCO, which the deadline is December of this year. With that, I have provided copies of our comments. We will be discussing the comments in more detail at our August 27th meeting, as we will be providing our commission an update on the transition plan and the dissolution process. With that, we will continue working with staff on this matter, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any other public comment? Okay, I'll bring it back to the board. Ms. Reimers, you had some comments.
Yes, some of the notes that I took at the workshop indicate that that there are several ongoing, the Mello-Roos and the Army and others indicated that working as a unit going forward in in making decisions for this area would give us is a stronger base and a stronger profile for this community. So I think that one of the things that I could support would be directing the staff report to for a limited single entity, and I think that that individual jurisdictions going off, I think, is not the best answer for the transition, and a FORA-like entity, a single entity, is a stronger position to be able to complete the base reuse projects that still are on the table. And I would just recommend that that be a direction that staff be directed to consider. And time is running out. We really do need to be specific about the directions that this board wants to take or feels they have to take to meet the deadlines.
Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Chair. I've heard a couple people allude to a specific issue, and I think Director Parker had talked about staff needing time to adjust, and so we have a lot of staff working on different issues that then it is the green light's showing. How's this? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Aha. So I'm hearing a couple of different places that a rate limiting step or an ambiguous point is the degree to which jurisdictions or other agencies' staff are making progress and working with FORA staff. So this is, I would expect, be a source of frustration for FORA staff because they can't control that. It's like pushing rope uphill. You know, you can't get others to do what you want them to do. But how can we encourage a sort of timely response, or even knowing where various jurisdictions are in the progress of their own discussions that then need to come back? And I don't really have it's a request, and I don't have a means by which to assure it. But I keep wondering. So anybody have any suggestions?
I think that's probably something that would be handled at the administrative committee and through the executive committee, putting a little bit of pressure, maybe.
Would it be appropriate to ask the administrative committee to make regular reports on progress in that regard? Since there's nobody here who's on it, could we ask them to consider it and report back on a method that they feel would be appropriate for keeping things on track and keeping reporting?
Yeah, I think Michael is taking notes on that, and he can.
As the co-chair of the administrative committee, I can bring that up at the meeting next Wednesday. It's not currently on our agenda, but under acknowledgments and announcements, I can make that clear that it was the board's suggestion that staff members, to the extent that they could, to move forward in the transition process so that they wouldn't slow down this part of the transition.
Yeah, things may be going along extremely well. We just have no idea.
I just wanted to be clear, we have offered to talk to every single jurisdiction. We have talked individually with almost every jurisdiction, not recently with City Manager Vaughn. We have talked directly when he's attended these meetings and participated actively. We certainly we're going to be making a presentation with the City of Monterey the end of the month of August. We have met with the county staff on 2 occasions and participated in county court committee meetings as well. We will continue to meet with anyone that requests a meeting. We met yesterday with Seaside staff and consultants. So we will continue to push the issue and remind the administrative committee on Wednesday.
Very good. So if there's no other comments, we'll deem this report received. Thank you. Okay. Next item is a business item, service work order for General Jim Moore Boulevard, second vote.
Yes, Chair. Jonathan Brinkman will provide a PowerPoint presentation outlining this item. There were some questions posed by a member of the board at the last meeting, which we addressed orally. Jonathan will provide a little more detail on those items in this PowerPoint presentation.
And this is the second vote?
This is second vote, yes.
Chair Rubio, members of the board, just wanted to provide some background here for today's second vote on service work order number 5 for General Jim Moore Boulevard. So the text here, I just want to point out that there is coordination. There was coordination back in 2005 and 2010 with both EAISs. There was one done in 2005 for the General Jim Moore Boulevard project. We have the quote up here about the intersection. The quote's about this intersection is going to be 300 feet north of the existing alignment of South Boundary Road. So this is 2005, the EAIS that the board certified and filed a notice of termination that the project was approved by the board. The second quote down here is from the environmental assessment, the EAIS initial study for South Boundary Road. It was in 2010. Here as well, it's describing the project, and it describes it as an intersection approximately 300 feet north of the existing intersection location. So I just wanted to point that out to the board. You may have heard some confusing remarks in discussion at the last board meeting. Just want to clarify it with some facts on the first slide here. So this is just a visual representation of what that would look like, overlaying in Google Maps or an aerial photograph, what we would look at in terms of a feasibility study on the roundabout, which is part of Service Work Order number 5. This is also a diagram out of the 2010 EAIS, also showing the realignment and the intersection moving 300 feet to the north. So today's recommendation to the board is to authorize the executive officer, take a second vote to authorize the executive officer to execute Service Work Order number 5 with Whitson Engineers for the General Jim Moore Boulevard and South Boundary intersection. And it's not to exceed $209,965.
Are there any questions on the clarification? Okay, is there any public comment?
Hi, my name is Nikki Nedeff, members of the board and FORA staff. I am the current president of the California Native Plant Society Monterey Bay chapter, and I'm here today in that capacity. I have two substantive comments on this particular agenda item. First of all, there is a standing legal agreement between the California Native Plant Society and FORA and the City of Delray Oaks regarding the configuration of the proposed improvements to South Boundary Road at General Jim Moore Boulevard. In our standing legal agreement, CMPS is supposed to be coordinated with. We're supposed to be consulted, and we have not yet been contacted. We look forward to hearing from FORA and the City of Delray Oaks regarding the proposed improvements to South Boundary Road. We look forward to that, and we anticipate hearing at some point from the FORA staff or from the board. Secondly, my other substantive comment has to do with the standing work order that you've included in your packet. There is a provision here under the second task, environmental services, with deliverables discussed a couple pages later and the timing of those deliverables. The deliverables say that the environmental services section, including the botanical report, must be delivered within 60 days. Botanical report cannot be completed adequately in the next 60 days for the area in question, impacted by the proposed road improvements. There are a number of federally endangered species, a number of federally threatened species, California endangered species, and rare species considered by the California Native Plant Society as protected. All of these species have different flowering periods, different phenological development timing. The phasing of different blooming periods is often reflective of precipitation and temperature. Many of these species are annual plants. They're going to be different every single year. So I just want to call your attention to the timing of what you're going to be approving this afternoon.
The botanical report is supposed to be done in 60 days. That cannot be done. And provide an adequate description of what's out there and what will be impacted. Also of note is that the botanical report...
Thank you. Your time is up.
Okay, refers specifically to only 2 plants, but there are other federally endangered species in that impact zone. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the board. I'm Michael Salerno from Keep Fort Ord Wild. We submitted a letter regarding this agenda item to the board. I hope the board had time to at least browse it. We have a number of concerns about going forward with this right now, and we'd urge a no vote. I'm going to highlight a few of those concerns. Fundamentally, there will be, if this is approved, there'd be 2 contracts for the same roundabout, and I'll explain that. Back in November 2017, FORA approved another contract with Whitson. Part of that contract, part of the deliverables were calculations for the feasibility of the roundabout. We've actually requested those calculations. They were supposed to be delivered within 60 days of that contract, which was back in December. We've been informed those calculations aren't available as a public record. Presumably, those calculations were the basis for going forward with a roundabout, but we don't seem to have them. Second thing I'd like to highlight is there's certainly an intersection contemplated in the 2005 General Jim Moore environmental document. However, it wasn't a roundabout. Roundabouts are great, but they have a much bigger footprint. And in this case, it's really critical because the footprint and the expanded area for the roundabout would be next to the native plant reserve. And finally, what I'd like to highlight is in the previous meeting about this item, there was an indication that there was a term used, consistency with meets and bounds. That's not the test for this project. The test is CEQA, and the test would be whether the project has a greater impact than analyzed in 2005. And if it's a larger roundabout, the indication is that it would be. So I'd urge you to take a look and consider this letter. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other public comment?
Yes, I believe the first public comment was about the CNPS FORA and Del Rey Oaks agreement. And so part of what we would do next, after, if the board were to take a second vote and that be a motion that passes, would be to sit down and work on what we need to do to comply with our agreement with CNPS and Del Rey Oaks. Another question was about the surveys, and it was actually about the biological report. So that report would be completed as part of the service work order. The surveys, the consultant has gone out to the field and done that at their own risk at this point. So they know that we were going to take this to the board, that there was only a certain time of the year that you can do these plant surveys, and that there's a risk that the board would not approve the contract. So they wouldn't potentially not get paid for that work. So the report can be completed is the basic response to that concern. Also, there were a few comments from another member of the public. The 2 contracts, there was a statement that there are 2 contracts. This is one contract. This is a master services contract with Whitson Engineers with multiple service work orders. So in terms of the roundabout feasibility study, it was previously listed in a service work order 2. We're moving it to service work order 5 as part of this approval. The work will not be duplicated. Another comment was about the intersection contemplated. Roundabouts are sometimes wider or larger intersections than other types of intersections. However, an intersection can be a roundabout. So the question of the feasibility study is, can we feasibly put a roundabout in here? And then in terms of the meets and bounds in CEQA, part of the service work orders states we will comply with the completed environmental documents. So we always intend to comply with the CEQA that has been completed to date.
If I may,
yes,
really quickly. As to the first speaker, and I apologize for forgetting her name, she seemed to indicate a lack of communication or opportunity to give input. Is this accurate? Is this the first time you've been hearing this, or what can you say as to her concerns?
So in terms of this work for General Jim Moore Boulevard, this intersection, we as staff also need to have the biological expertise and engineering expertise to look at what the design would be before you can talk about what the effects might be to the Native Plant Society parcel. So in terms of getting that coordination going, we need the expertise to be able to have something to discuss.
So in fact, evidently there's been no discussion, a limited discussion with her or her organization at this point as far as input as to what her concerns are. Are there concerns are?
The input was provided during the environmental review process. In terms of contracting to build this part of the roadway that was considered in the environmental review, we haven't gone that far, so those discussions haven't started.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, yes, please.
I'm a little confused about timing and want to make sure I know what the sequence would be. And it sounds as if we would be voting to go ahead with a project that then will be discussed. And what I'm curious about is if you find in discussion with the Native Plant Society that something, could you find in discussions about plants that something about this project that we've approved needs to be changed? Or is the scope of discussions with Native Plant Society more about protection and mitigation than actually changing the nature of this already approved scope?
So to answer that question, the main point of meeting with the CNPS is to follow what we're required to do with our agreement. So Native Plant Society gets a reserve, gets an area that's north of the existing South Boundary Road. So that agreement says we need to coordinate together.
No.
Yes. So we will comply with that agreement, meet with CNPS, because the new road alignment is adjacent to that property. That's the general gist of the coordination that's needed. There are also endangered species plants in the area. So the environmental document identified appropriate mitigation measures. So that is the need that for the biological surveys that have been conducted and the scope item to complete a biological report. So in terms of project changes, the approved environmental document talks about doing these surveys in order for us to coordinate proper permitting, proper avoidance measures that we could do to avoid taking or removing of these endangered plant species.
So, may I ask a follow-up? So it sounds as if your work with plant expertise would be about how this work is going to be done rather than what the nature of the actual project is.
Correct.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Supervisor Phillips.
Is there a timing problem? Do we have to do this within a certain length of time?
The bigger time frame issue is the FORA sunset. We want to get this project moving ahead before sunset.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So my concern about going forward with this contract and so on had to do with the environmental work, because it seems that was done long ago. And I think we need to stay pretty current. And from what I had understood at the last meeting, I had understood that we were going to go ahead with this work, and then there would be another level of CEQA review that would happen before construction happens. Is that accurate, or have I misunderstood what's proposed?
The CEQA on this project is done. So it studied the alignment of General Jim to the intersection with South Boundary. And so this has already been completed in terms of what the CEQA impacts were, what the mitigation measures were. What staff is looking for with this contract is the design and the other biological services needed to complete the design, prepare the documents for bid, and take it out for public bid.
Okay, and then and so then the biological surveys. I think you mentioned earlier that Whitson Engineers or somebody went out and did those already, sort of on spec, so that those would be all done and they can be included in the report that's going to come in 90 days from the issuance of the contract. But that was done without consultation with the California Native Plant Society, it sounds. So how is that a problem for us? I mean, it sounds like it may be if we're supposed to be consulting with them on plants and biological things.
Yeah, I'll let our consultant come up.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. I'm Erin Harlan with Denise Duffing Associates. We did complete the botanical surveys outlined in the work order on knowing that the approval might be delayed past the blooming period of the species. And I did want to clarify a few things. One is that the CEQA has been completed for the project. The EAIS AFONSI was recorded. The finding of no significant impact and the mitigated neg deck were filed on, I don't have the date right in front of me, but it was 2016. And so part of that certification and adoption was also included the adoption of a mitigation and monitoring plan, MMRP, which included a number of biological measures that need to be complied with. So we were brought on board to comply with those mitigation measures. And to just clarify Nikki's comment, the reason we only survey for those two species is because that was the requirement of the MMRP, so that we could avoid and reduce impacts to those species. And if we needed to, if impacts were to occur, we would get the appropriate permits. And so the second part of this is that so we were brought on board to coordinate with the project engineers to determine whether any changes in design would influence or impact these species in a different way than what was analyzed. And also, in response to Michael Salerno's comment, we're not just looking at the metes and bounds of project footprint of any design changes, but we're also looking at if the plans deviate from the design approved in the environmental document, we would look at it from an entire CEQA standpoint, from aesthetics to noise to air quality. We'd run through the whole gamut of the checklist to make sure we weren't triggering any new significant impacts with any design changes. And if we were, we would do any subsequent environmental documentation.
Let me follow up with you for just a second there, Erin. And this contract also includes studying the feasibility of a roundabout.
Correct.
Yeah, so it's not saying it is a roundabout.
It's not going to be a roundabout for sure. We're looking at all the different times have changed.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I thought the city of Delray Oaks had a great relationship with the Native Plant Society. Reason being, well over 10 years ago, Mayor Bartlett at the time and myself met with two representatives, two nice ladies that came up and said, we found some rare species on Delray Oaks. Would you like to look at it with us? And we went out there at the corner of South Boundary Road and at that time North-South Road, and they found some species out there. They said, we'd like to set this aside for a restricted area, so these species, and we said, fine. We were cooperating with them. It's for the species and so forth. Thought we'd have a great relationship, and we set it aside. over the years, we've been talking about moving that because of the relationship of South Boundary Road and the intersection. I never thought we'd come back a decade later with follow-on members trying to sabotage a major project for Delray Oaks because we were good enough in the first place to volunteer land to give to them in the first place for free. That's the first thing. Second of all, the so-called letter from KFAL coming in here about the legal problems with regard to this intersection, that was received by us after 1 o'clock this afternoon. Our meeting starts at 2. I would think that a legal firm, if they really cared about coming up with things they really thought would be helpful in working together with us to move forward, would give us that information more than 45 minutes before this meeting. It's very hard to look at a legal document in 45 minutes. I think you can see where this is going, about delay, and more delay. We've got less than 2 years to go. We're trying to get the project done. At one time, the CIP for Delray Oaks was the #1 CIP in the entire Fort Ord region. We deferred and let other cities, including Marina, take the priority on the CIP. And now it's coming down to Monterey and Delray Oaks. And it's Katie bar the door trying to stop, obfuscate, and do everything you possibly can to hurt those last 2 cities. Enough said.
Ms. Morton.
Yes, so Erin, I'm trying to reconcile what you've said with what's in the environmental assessment for the 2010 Gig Lane South Boundary Road environmental assessment initial study. And that statement therein says widening of South Boundary Road within the alignment as proposed by the project would be largely dependent upon the outcome of negotiations with the California Native Plant Society to relocate a currently identified habitat preserve area further south. And this was an agreement, as the mayor from Delray Oaks has said, that the Native Plant Societies, FORA and Delray Oaks, were involved in and designated 2 acres. It's my understanding that this current widening in the plan would require relocation of that from the northern side to the southern side to a completely different area. So wouldn't we need to do this negotiation before we approve a plan?
That's an excellent question, Director Morton. And so how I read these tasks and how I've been involved with both the South Boundary and the General Jim Moore projects now is that we're still getting our bearings. I haven't even seen any designs from Whitson yet. So like Jonathan mentioned, I feel that we need to understand what's out there, bring some options to the table while trying to be consistent with the existing environmental analyses for both those projects, and meet with Nikki. This parcel's been on my boundary or on my radar for many years, working with Delray Oaks on other projects as well. So we know what's out there, and we want to make sure to coordinate with them, but we don't have a plan to take and design to take to them yet. I haven't been approved on this project yet.
Okay, so in other words, we need to do this work to answer all those questions. Ms. Schreiner.
I appreciate the Director Edlin's comments, and I would hope that he would also recognize these people are volunteers who take their time to come in and try to make sure that some of the criteria of the past keeps coming forward into the planning process as we move through. And I have a question. First of all, is what months were the botany surveys completed in the earlier work? Because I'm aware that with the native plants, you're going to need certain rainy seasons. And I think that was the point of the public speaker, that if we have it within the next 60 days, it's not so likely to have a rainy season. So I looked at the list at page 31. It looks like the task 2, all it is the botanical survey map and memorandum. It is, due a little bit earlier than, say, task 3 or task 4. It's 60 days. So could task 2.2, the botanical survey map and memorandum, be moved, say, to 4.11 or some kind of appendix for 4, so that it might be due in 210 days. That way it doesn't hold up any of the work, because the other deadlines are 210 days. but it would allow 210 days, and my estimate is about 7 months. It might allow some of the rainy season to be included, and therefore some of the water-dependent native plants to have a chance to make a showing rather than being dormant as I would expect they would be now. Thank you.
Yes, we just addressed this question. The surveys have been done during the appropriate time, so they were done at risk. There's no contract at the time. Denise Duffy and Associates went out to the field and did the surveys. So they take the risk of the board not approving the contract. But if the board were to approve the contract, that report could be written and include the information from this year.
I appreciate that idea that you expressed that the survey was done in appropriate months, but could you please specify, was it, say, January? Was it, say, February? Could you specify which month it was?
And Erin can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the blooming plants are during the May, June timeframe. That was done at the appropriate time. Okay, probably April, May, June. Okay, I probably missed a month. And then there's a fall survey. I think it's like June and July for one of the species.
So I might be getting my projects mixed up, but there are specific plant species called out in the 2 MMRPs for the projects. For General Jim Moore, our specific species of concern was seaside birdsbeak. So I don't have my staff here to tell me the exact days, but we did reconnaissance level surveys of known populations in the area to track the blooming period and make sure we got the peak blooming period. And within June and July is when we were able to see peak bloom at the site.
Thank you. And would it affect your work to have task 2.2 be moved to a section with 4 so that it could be done in 210?
This is the proposed scope. We constantly update our scope and our schedule with the consultants. So if there's a more efficient way, we are hearing your feedback and we'll update the schedule as needed.
Okay, I was thinking because this is August, so August, September is slightly different than June and July, but it may give them at least a rainy season. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other comments?
I just want to call for the vote.
I'll second it.
So you're making a motion to
motion to this is a second vote. I move approval.
And I second it.
There's a motion and a second. Okay, roll call vote, please.
Director Rubio?
Yes.
Director Parker?
Yes.
Director Adams? Absent. Director Phillips?
Yes.
Director O'Connell?
No.
Director Hoffa?
Yes.
Director Alexander?
Yes.
Director Gunter?
Yes.
Director Reimers?
Yes.
Director Edelin?
Yes.
Director Morton? Director Carbone? Director Garfield?
Yes.
10-2 vote.
10-2. Okay, that carries. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next item, which is a consistency determination for the City of Marina Municipal Airport Master Plan update. Mr. Hulamar.
Chair, members of the board, this airport master plan update has been presented to the administrative committee, has been presented to the planners working group. Jonathan Brinkman will provide a brief PowerPoint presentation. I think actually Jeff Kretschrew will do that from the City of Marina. Just to be clear, both the planners working group and the administrative committee found this to be consistent with the base reuse plan, as did the airport, I believe, the Airport Land Use Commission.
Good afternoon, members of the board and members of the public. I'm Jeff Kretschrew, City of Marina Airport Services Manager. I have with me a colleague, Christine Hopper, the Planning Manager for the Community Development Department at City of Marina. In 2013, the City of Marina, the airport, received an FAA grant for about $300,000 to update our airport master plan. The previous master plan was completed in 2008. It was led by Kaufman and Associates, a leading national airport planning firm, through subbing through Tartaglia Engineering, who's the airport engineer of record. FAA likes to see that airports update their master plans every 7 to 10 years for the purpose of having a current and FAA-approved airport layout plan, which affects our eligibility for FAA development grants. Let's see. There we go. All right, and 2, to provide a long-term 20-year plan for airport development. 3, to maximize the economic development of the airport and city and of the region, and to address local changes in aviation use, such as your mix of aircraft coming into the airport, and to reserve adequate land for aviation and non-aviation revenue producing needs. We engaged in late 2013 forming a public advisory committee. We enacted the first meeting there in January of 2014. The purpose of the Planning Advisory Committee was to review the chapters of inventory, forecasts, and facility requirements, and then to then come up with their, in May, their second meeting, airport alternatives, and then we accumulated that in August of 2014 with a third PAC committee meeting and a public information workshop. That led to the development of the recommended development plan, and then a financial plan for the capital improvements and airport layout plans, and that was all presented back to the Planning and Advisory Committee there in June of 2015. We held another public information workshop. We undertook the CEQA environmental process in February 2018, which was an initial study resulting in a mitigated negative declaration. And also, as a part of the master plan, we updated our airport land use compatibility analysis and plan, and that is currently under review by the airport, the County Airport Land Use Commission. Just a brief overview of airport facilities. So current facilities, roughly 13 existing buildings, a field farm with both 100 low lead and Jet A. And so we have a fairly current small area of operation. Certainly we're looking to expand on building development opportunities. One of the critical pieces for an airport is your design aircraft. Marina's always been a small single prop airport known as classification B1. Currently, through this process, we were able to upgrade that classification to a B2. And our future hope in the recommended concept is to qualify to be a C2 airport, which would include various sizes of business jets. Moving on to the recommended concept, you can see here that you have in yellow some planning for the potential of new buildings on the airfield. The highlight, the main piece here is the runway itself and the all westerly extension to a 5,800 foot runway. This creates an issue where we have mitigated for penetration into the existing habitat reserve on the west end. And you can see that the RPZ goes out to the west there, out off of the airport property. This is a landside closer viewpoint for kind of a plan of where we might try to develop future buildings on the airport within the footprint on the south side of the runway. And then finally, to wrap up, this is the land use plan. To note, we did not change any land uses from prior land uses that were presented in the previous airport master plan. But I would like to point out that up to the northern point there, as you go out airport, the revenue support area there to the north, you have a habitat mitigation area that is consistent along the western boundary with the current existing habitat reserve. So that is the mitigation for the runway extension. And also to highlight the areas that are lined with yellow hash, both at the east end and the west end of the airport, would be property for future acquisition, as FAA likes to see airports own property that are under the runway protection zone where feasible. With that, we're here for any questions. Thank you.
Any questions from the board? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate getting this this update. I had a question, and I think my first question is really for maybe for FORA staff. I'm looking at the last bullet point under number 3, under the consistency determination. So, is in substantial conformance with the applicable programs specified in the reuse plan. And the last bullet refers to the economic development in the area and the building as it relates to building height. And my concern is that it looks as though the FAA allows building heights to be up to 200 feet, probably close to the airport runway, and then maybe higher going out. It says in that bullet point that basically around 50 feet is the maximum height allowed under marina zone and codes and so on. And I'm concerned that we're not maximizing the economic development potential if we're having low buildings where we could have higher buildings, if higher buildings can have more stuff in them. So I guess I'm wondering, is there guidance in the FORA plan that gives a desired maximum height or speaks to that? And then curious about Marina's motivation, whether it's at the UCM best or in the airport area more directly, why the building heights are kept so low.
So quickly, from an airport's perspective, building heights are restricted when it's underneath the horizontal surface, which is the area of influence of the airport, and so that has with relation to its closeness to the runway. So that's all pretty much set in principle by FAA, and obviously we would be looking to maximize those building heights. A clarification on the 200 feet is certainly any building over 200 feet does directly fall under the jurisdiction of needing FAA approval.
Right, I understand that. So we're basically working within 200 feet or below, but your maximums currently are 56 feet and 50 feet. That's a lot less than 200. I just think there's quite a bit of economic development potential that you're missing out on if you're trying to put things out to bid to attract people and they can only go to 50 feet. I'm just not, I mean, maybe they would only want to go to 50 feet, but if they knew they could go to 200, I'm just wondering what that's about.
Hi, thank you. Christy Hopper, the Planning Services Manager for Marina. The current height restrictions, we are restricted by our zoning ordinance because we do have airport zoning, which limits the height of adjacent to the airport at 56 feet and 50 feet at UCM best, from what I understand. So that's in our current zoning as well in our comprehensive land use plan, limiting the height. From what I understand from Jeff too, is as you get closer to the runway, the buildings get shorter. So within that 0 to 200 feet, the city has jurisdiction on approving those. The FAA, of course, reviews our plans. But when we get above 200 feet, that's the statement in the plan where the FAA actually has to do some approvals. So We don't have a history on where the 56 feet came in. We assume that what it was is with the evaluation on the allowed buildings on the property and their adjacency to the runway, that came up with that 56 feet for safety reasons.
I just find it confusing that if the FAA allows 200, but anyway, all right, so I'm confused. And then my other question has to do with, oh, well, there's the FORA person.
Yes, so. I know you asked the question about what does the base reuse plan have to say with that. And I did have a presentation prepared, but I would ask the chair's indulgence to give that very brief. It's about 6 slides. All right. So in terms of the FORA board and why we make consistency determinations, it's in the government code that created FORA. And there are 2 different types of consistency determinations. We have legislative land use decisions and we have development entitlements. The airport master plan is in the legislative land use decision category. Future development entitlements would be presented to FORA. And this is differentiation between the 2. So legislative land use decisions are the general plans, are the general plan amendments, and there's zoning or zoning code. The development entitlements might be parcel maps, conditional use permits, or individual project entitlements. In terms of what was submitted to FORA for this consistency determination, we received the airport master plan. It included the final airport master plan, the environmental document, which is an initial study, mitigated negative declaration, and also the full consistency determination analysis table, worksheet, and RUDGE checklist. So in terms of this particular consistency determinations, there's some considerations here. The airport master plan provided for changes in land use designations. So that was in order to allow for the runway to be extended into the habitat reserve, the Marina Airport Habitat Reserve. But this is offset by changing adjacent development land into habitat reserve land. So that's part of this airport master plan. The airport master plan is also in an area that has a proposed FORTAG, the four-door recreational trail and greenway. So part of that, the airport master plan is drafted to meet FAA requirements, and to meet that, they don't allow for trail planning. So this is an area in the RUDGE identified for trails. We'll get that to there later, but it wasn't evaluated for trails because it wasn't part of the plan. The Marina Airport is also adjacent to the University of California MBEST. Both of these areas, the airport and the MBEST, have been anticipated for significant job growth in the base reuse plan. So these are typically our standards for consistency review. We look at land use, we look at density, we look at the designations. We mentioned about the habitat reserve changing of development into the reserve for the runway, and then offsetting that by increased reserve in a different area just north of where that runway extension is proposed to happen. We look at, does it allow for implementation of the habitat management plan? This would allow for implementation. It may require a habitat management plan amendment to implement the runway extension when that moves forward someday. We also look at the RUDGE. Are the regional urban design guidelines being met? And the City of Marina submitted a checklist. As we mentioned, trail planning was the one area identified in the RUDGE for this area, but it didn't apply to this plan. It wasn't allowed in the plan. So it was not applicable in this instance. We also look at the base reuse plan policies and programs. That was submitted by Marina staff as a checklist. So it met the requirements of the policies and programs. We look at the development and resource management plan. So typically we look at water usage. There's no water being entitled or no uses that would have to use water resources. This is a plan approval. It's not a specific development that would use water. We look at residential units. Similarly, there's no residential allowed in the airport. We look at the fair share contribution. There's no, the Marina would implement its fair share contribution provided in the implementation agreement with FORA. And then we look at prevailing wage. This does not change prevailing wage requirements. So in terms of the staff recommendation, we, along with the administrative committee and the planners working group, recommend the board approve a resolution certifying the airport master plan as consistent with the base reuse plan. To get to the question on the height, Okay, so the question on the height, what does the base use plan say about height? It says, in general terms, mature vegetation, which we interpreted in the RUDGE. We said 5 stories in certain mixed-use areas. That was in the RUDGE, and 2.5 stories for residential, pretty much everywhere else. So that was the guidance from the RUDGE. We know with Highway 1, there's design guidelines for Highway 1. There are height limits there, but there are ways to amend those height limits in Highway 1 as well.
I still have a question. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then I did have another question about so I'm glad that the airport runway extension, that habitat area gets, made up for by designating another habitat area. The habitat area that, as far as I could tell by reading, that is being designated newly was kind of an intensive commercial and light industrial area. This particular area around the airport with UCM Best is like the remaining big place for economic development. And so I guess my question is there another place where that commercial and industrial space is going to be made up for, since some of the land that was going to be used for that is now being used for habitat? I mean, I want both. So I'm just curious what Marina has done and what FORA's perspective is on finding that replacement land for the economic development use.
Yeah, I would just speculate as FORA staff that extension of the runway is going to increase. Our concept is, or the Marina's concept would be, the runway extension is going to provide more opportunities for different types of aircraft to land and more business opportunities at the airport itself, thus offsetting that development for the increase in habitat.
A different kind of commercial and light industrial. Okay, that's could happen. So then that gets me back to my concern, and I don't know that FORA has anything to say about this, but I do have a concern as a FORA board member and member of the community that this height issue may be limiting the number and type of economic development in terms of commercial and light industrial and research that may be able to happen in that area if we're not maximizing the building heights. And to me, I would think that's a FORA issue, but the only place I mean, because it's being discussed as building height, and I guess the only thing we've got really is the design guidelines saying 5 stories in some areas. I don't know if that's precise enough. I mean, apparently the other people didn't think so, but I don't know. It's just something that we haven't been very successful yet in our economic development apart from CSUMB. So, but that's the area, and I really want to make sure that we keep the opportunity there and that we're maximizing all of the options that we have to have there be the kind of economic development that was envisioned.
Okay, Mayor Gunter.
We discussed the 5-story buildings at the Airport Land Use Commission for Monterey County, and having been previous president of the California International Air Show and knowing that pilot safety and safety of the surrounding public is extremely important, that it wasn't even brought up or discussed any further because we have several pilots on that board, and they were big on protecting the habitat, and they said if you put one of those planes down with fuel on it, you're not going to have any habitat or any buildings, and they were highly concerned that we have just added something in Salinas with the new truck stop, and they were hot on us about how high the sign can be, let alone buildings that people would be in, and that would be in the same, and they would bring it back, and they felt that this airport was a bit within the consistency determination for the airport, and they did Monterey's at the same time, and that discussion was held with them, as well as a building in Sand City that is, I thought, pretty far out. So it's pretty consistent with the fact that safety has become the #1 concern, both for the pilot and for the city of Marina. If they build a building and somebody dies, the cost would be phenomenal.
So that's true not just right next to the runway, but all the way out to UCM Best?
Probably. because they travel a long way when they go down.
Wow, maybe not such a good place for all.
To that point on building height, we actually have to, anytime a structure is proposed on airport property or in the surrounding areas, we go through an exercise called an FA, obstruction analysis, to make sure that we are within safety guidelines, but also, you know, how well we can accommodate what is planned for. So to that extent, we would hope to maximize building heights, but also remain safe.
Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Chair Rubio. I have questions, not concerns. So just at this point, just questions. And it's particularly related to the habitat, the land swap, 30 acres for 38 acres. And you're taking, I'd like for someone to comment on the quality of the land on each of those. So what kind of habitat is being exchanged for what kind of land with what's on it? Are they qualitatively equal in terms of preservation? So that's my first question. Let's get that one done, and then I'll go to the next one. Thank you.
So to the extent of the quality of what the vegetation is on the ground, it is very similar in nature. We've had recent biological surveys that showed that. So we looked to try to replace with like property. It may help the board to feel comfortable with the fact that that was presented to both U.S. Fish and Wildlife as well as the state of California Fish and Wildlife, and we received an official concurrence from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, kind of an unofficial concurrence from California Fish and Wildlife, because they stated that they could not provide something in writing to approve that they agree with the mitigation until there's a specific project. So, but to the extent that they were pleased, they liked that it was consistent with being congruent to the current habitat area, and so it seemed to please both of those groups as well.
Thank you. And that leads me to my other question, is that you have a bullet item here that says California Department of Fish and Wildlife did not offer concurrence on the AMP. It didn't say that they said they would, but didn't, but it says that they did not offer concurrence. And it does say that it will resurface when the runway extension becomes a project, so it's still unknown. But it says that the action will likely require an HMP amendment and additional mitigations. So that says to me that this swap is not equal in somebody's eyes, or that they're not on board with it. And so with that said, if we approve going ahead with something that California Department of Fish and Wildlife did not approve, does that put the FORA board at any risk to be approving something that was not approved by a group that might litigate against us?
So just to stress that the airport master plan is a programmatic document. There are no projects that are associated with it at this time. In the mitigated negative declaration, there is pretty substantial mitigation that addresses the biological issue. So at every project, we will have to do additional CEQA review, really focusing on the biological. So as we go through any type of amendment, dedication of that land, that would end up being a project. At that point, we would hope we would get a consensus from California Fish and Wildlife. But you're correct, they were not willing to put anything in writing, because unless a project came before them.
Okay. Going back to you,
I would add that it probably adds little risk to the FORA board at the program level. There is no question but that the city of Marina, the airport folks, would have to get 2085 permit at the time a project would move forward. That's when they're really going to get the permit to move ahead with the runway as it pertains to habitat.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you laying that out. And so my last question is, does your intent to add jets change anything about the experience of those living nearby, breathing nearby, subject to spills nearby? You get it.
Well, so again, we had a couple different opportunities along the way. Well, there's been several opportunities as we've gone to the Planning Commission and the council's adopted the action, the public workshops, the advisory committee. We had no negative input from stakeholders, including residents close around. And to add to that, we've actually had up to 5 different jets operating at the airport. They've based there and been in hangars off and on over the last 4 years. And I actually get more. I've had no noise complaints. I've had one inquiry as to what is that big thing going over near where I can see it go out to the north, and that was the Gulfstream 3. It's a significantly much larger aircraft than one might expect at the airport. But noise complaint actually tends to focus around the skydive plane with the fact that it's a turboprop and it kind of circles and climbs. So.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Reimers.
I just have a question about the jets and the sound, but also, is this going to become a commercial airport? Do you anticipate that in the future?
No, we do not anticipate it being a commercial airport.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
So once you fully plan on all that, what's the ceiling of how many jets will be coming in a day? So I do live about a half hour.
Okay. Well, we haven't contemplated a cap on that. Certainly, the region tends to see more jet activity around regional events, such as we're looking at the U.S. Open time frame next year, the Auto Week with Concours d'Elegance, AT&T, large golf events. That's where you tend to see an increase. So for short periods of time, you could see significant increases in activity level. Right now, jets are not going to normally come to the airport and operate on a daily base. Without it being a commercial operation, it's typically a dry lease situation or a private operator. So I suspect that you're not going to see daily numbers much more than probably 10 flights in a day for the most part.
Any other questions? Yes, Ms. Carbone.
Hi, I just had one question, and that would be, the speaker said that there would not be any commercial use. You don't contemplate any drones with the legislation changing perhaps this year, where drones may be used and for maybe like Federal Express, anything like that? You don't?
I'll clarify my point.
Okay.
No commercial jetliners to move people. Yes, we would hope to actually, we were in a joint effort with FORA to look at a UAS integration designation for the airport. So yes, we would certainly entertain commercial activity around drone development, drone integration into the airspace. So yes, we would hope, and we've always contemplated at Marina that because of our central location, that we are an ideal candidate for having a shipper come in and out, use the airport and business park.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's open it up to the public. Any public comment? Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back. Any other discussion, comments? There's a motion and a second to approve the consistency determination for the City of Marina Municipal Airport Master Plan. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. The next item is a consistency determination for the City of Seaside zoning code. Mr.
Yes.
Brinkman.
Yes, Chair, there'll be a presentation that'll be the partnered presentation with City of Seaside and Jonathan Brinkman. I think Kurt Overmeyer will be presenting for the City of Seaside. This is an item that's been generally before the board in the past. In fact, in 2004, the City of Seaside's general plan came before the board. The board found it consistent with the Fort Base Reuse Plan. This zoning code implements the components of the general plan. And again, the Planners Working Group and the Fort Ord Reuse Authority Administrative Committee both are recommending that the board find consistency with the base reuse plan.
Okay. Very similar presentation to the last one. Just wanted to point out here, these plans aren't final until they receive FORA board certification. So that's something in the state code I forgot to mention it the first time around. So what we received from Seaside as a submittal was the ordinances amending their zoning code, and this is the list in their submittal package. We received the 2006 zoning code, 2014 zoning code, 2014 to 18 zoning errata adopted by the City Council, and the current zoning map, and you see that on the screen here. And also with that package, we received their consistency determination analysis table, worksheet, and RUDGE checklist. So we have a different set of considerations here with Seaside. So this submittal is both consistent with the land use and the zoning areas on former Fort Ord with the 2004 Seaside General Plan. That's the current general plan in Seaside that's in effect right now. The FORA board found that general plan consistent in December 2004. So in that consistency determination 2004, there was a zoning for high density residential that was more dense than the base use plan. The board found on balance that was consistent with the base use plan. It was 25 dwelling units per acre. The base use plan allows up to 20, but the board found that consistent. So this zoning code just implements that general plan. So it also includes the same high density residential numbers as the 2004 general plan. The new zoning updates that were in that list that I just went over include some new types of uses, such as a brewery with a restaurant, daycare centers, smoke shops, game centers, youth hostel, and veterinary clinics. There's also new development standards added to enhance the appearance of the streetscape. We're using the same standards of review. So we looked at the land use, the designations, the density, also, as we mentioned, with the 2004 general plan. We also look at the habitat management plan implementation. Just to note, in Seaside, the only habitat management area in Seaside is the National Monument. There's no other habitat reserves in Seaside. In terms of the RUDGE, the Regional Urban Design Guidelines, Seaside submitted their checklist. It shows how different zoning code items are fulfilled in the RUDGE checklist. Some are not because it's based on a 2004 general plan that there was no RUDGE at the time. We also have a development resource management plan that we look at. This does not entitle any additional development. It does not entitle any residential units, so there'd be no water or increase in residential units with this determination. We look at the fair share contribution. There's no changes in the FORA implementation agreement. FORA would get its fair share of future development. There's no changes in prevailing wage. And just want to note here as well, in the FORA master resolution, there's a section, it's 8.01.020G. It provides that the board can only refuse to certify a legislative land use decision such as the zoning code if it demonstrates that that zoning code, that legislative land use decision, doesn't conform with the adopted general plan. So that would be the evidence that would need to be provided for the board to make to refuse to certify. So that is staff's recommendation that the FORA board find this consistent, as well as that's the administrative committee's recommendation as well. And we're available with Seaside to answer any questions the board may have.
Any questions for staff?
Mr. Chair. Yeah, I had a question about in the zoning code, an area that in the base reuse plan was designated as a community park is shown as high-density residential in the Seaside general plan, and that concerns me. I know we've just been told that if FORA has already approved the general plan as consistent, it is no matter what. But I also understand that the city of Seaside more recently has said, oh, we're going to have that be a community park with some accommodation with the nurses' barracks and so on. So I guess my question is, when is the zoning map going to reflect the community park as a community park?
Thank you, Supervisor Parker. So recently, let me start off by saying in the 2004 general plan consistency determination, the board's action actually moved that 50-acre park to a parcel on Seaside East and several parcels throughout the what's now called the Seaside Highlands development. So we actually replaced that 50-acre park with some other land. But recently we were working on creating a 5-acre parcel and developing or redeveloping the existing structures that are commonly called the medical officers' barracks. As part of that process, City Council agreed to stipulate that the remaining 35 acres of the 40-acre parcel that sits on would become essentially perpetually preserved habitat. And then we were subsequently sued, even though we agreed to do that anyway, and just recently signed the settlement, which now actually legally requires that parcel be maintained as that habitat. So it actually ends up with the 50 acres total that we were talking about in the previous version of the base reuse plan before this new general plan moved that parkland to elsewhere. That 25 acres per unit now is 0.8 acres per unit for that whole parcel.
Thank you. And so the question is, when is that going to be reflected on the map?
So the City of Seaside is in the process. We are very close to moving forward with a very modern, very progressive general plan. That will sometime towards the end of this year go to City Council for action. And shortly thereafter that, we're working on a form-based zoning ordinance that is designed, both the general plan and the form-based zoning ordinance, to be in 100% compliance with the base reuse plan as it is right now. Also 100% in compliance with the RUDG, and it'll actually make most of the RUDG, actually all of the RUDG ideas propagate throughout the City of Seaside. So that should happen sometime around the end of this year.
So you're putting it in the new general plan rather than just making an amendment to the existing one?
Oh, well, that would require a map amendment, and by the time we got through the CEQA and the map amendment, we'd be already there, so it doesn't seem to make sense to do that when we're already concurrently in the other effort.
Gotcha. Got it. Thank you. And then my other question is probably more for FORA staff. So it has to do with the density. So FORA requires a 20 units per acre density. Seaside has 25 units per acre. Why was staff willing to have Seaside have a different number and not be consistent with the base reuse plan?
So part of the 2004 general plan update that the board found consistent, it included an increase in park space overall. So I think that was part of the board's consideration in finding general consistency with that general plan. Similarly with this zoning code, it's the same amount of park space or even more we're talking about right now with the 30-acre parcel. It's now going to be mostly open space or park space. So there's an increase in parks compared to other uses.
Okay, but I think that, well, so far we don't have, we have verbal assurance and we have some actions that the city has taken, but there isn't anything reflected in the documents that we have here about the community park, for instance. Was there something documented about this sort of agreement that, 25 units per acre is okay because we're getting this extra park space? Was that documented somewhere?
There are 4 board findings with the 2004 general plan consistency.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Alexander.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, very similar question. So, when the 25 units per acre was granted, I'm assuming, as you just said, there was no hesitancy. So, is there a cushion? Is there a cushion this board offers? Above what's, or I guess, yeah, a cushion offered above that stays within, gives us consistency. Percentage, I guess?
So the FORA board looks at general consistency. We don't look at strict adherence to the base reuse plan. It's not some plan that must be copied word for word, land use by land use. But what we look at in analysis for consistency is, are we exceeding those thresholds? Are we doing more development and less park space or open space that was provided for in the base reuse plan? That's what we look for in consistency determinations.
Mr. Job.
So to me, generally there's an advantage to density in terms of more units and more units that are affordable, but I'm wondering if that's a concern for some directors. Could we add language to this approval that would stipulate that the consistency is in some way tied to the park space increase?
You would have to find you'd have to make a finding that it's not substantially in conformance, and then you'd have to give reasons why, and that would be the reason, and ask them to resubmit. That's what we've done in the past. County of Monterey knows that all too well. In this case, I believe all of the things that are in this zoning ordinance do substantially comply with what was adopted in 2004. That's really the test. There are a great number of efficiencies that both Seaside and the FORA board found in doing this. Less infrastructure, more park space, more compliance with the regional urban design guidelines, or at least the idea of being more efficient with available land, reusing existing disturbed areas. So all of those things were part of what was submitted in 2004. This zoning submittal is essentially the same. Jonathan, I think there was only there was no real alteration with the exception of the one parcel where it's called for more residential, and it's in a separate agreement with the park.
Right, and the first answer that Kurt Overmeyer gave is not with that particular high density residential parcel is not part of this zoning code. That is a settlement that will be coming forward, as he mentioned, with their general plan that's pending later this year.
Okay, is there any public comment?
Michael Salerno, Keep Fort Ord Wild. Supervisor Parker actually raised a portion of my point, and maybe we can cut through the confusion. The letter from Seaside dated July 26 had a series of attachments, which I just realized today are actually hyperlinks in the online packet. And so number 12 of that was what I guess is the current zoning map, which is not consistent with the maps in the reuse plan for Seaside land use, and is also not consistent with the recent settlement with Keep Fort Ord Wild. So I guess my question, or my first comment would be, it appears what we have today, the documents in front of us, are not consistent. So what is the resolution? It looks like Seaside is moving towards a general plan update that will make everything line up. But in terms of what we have today, what is resolution? And I know Seaside has made that commitment to the park, which is fantastic, but how does that affect the vote today? I'll throw that question out to the board. Thank you.
Is there any other public comment? Staff.
So simply answered, the action that's before the board today is to find consistency of the zoning ordinance with the land use element of the general plan that already achieved a consistency determination. That parcel, the parcel in question, had high-density residential land use, which is defined in our general plan as being 25 units an acre. The high-density residential zoning actually meets the land use decision that was already made by the FORA board and is therefore consistent with the base reuse plan, because when a general plan is adopted as part of and adopted and found in consistency, it becomes part of the part of the forward base reuse plan at that point.
Very good. Okay.
May I
Yes.
just ask a follow-up to that? So what this plan would be consistent with your current general plan in Seaside, and that's what you're asking us to state, that because the general plan in 2004 was found consistent, even though that was perhaps not true, now you're revising your general plan. So if we approve this, the city of Seaside does in fact come forward with an amended general plan for consistency. Now this is going to be inconsistent. What's the correction?
Well, when a general plan is adopted, there's a land use element that goes into the zoning ordinance that's adopted, usually shortly thereafter, as part of that new general plan. And in our case, we're doing a major general plan update, not the average 5-year update. We're doing the big deal, everything gets updated general plan. So, and I just wanted one point of clarification. The existing general plan is now the base reuse plan. This is a zoning ordinance, which is a land use overlay on top of a general plan that is exactly consistent with that base reuse, with the now base reuse plan and the Seaside general plan. The new general plan, I think, will be even better, and it will have to come to FORA for consistency, and I think y'all will be very pleased with what we've done. But that's a few months away, and we have projects we'd like to get out of the ground right now.
Thank you.
Okay, any other? Sure.
So I'm struggling with this because, and it's on the density issue. I mean, I think we've talked about the community park, and I mean, it just seems weird to me that we're going to say it's consistent when it really maybe wasn't originally, but whatever. So we're all in a complicated place. But I just have an issue with saying that an amount of density is consistent with the base reuse plan when it wasn't, when it came, and it still sort of isn't. And not that I don't like density. It makes a lot of sense. But I think for me, the issue is, if it's going to be consistent with the base reuse plan, it needs to be consistent with the base reuse plan. If you then have a project that you want to do that is denser, and there might be an issue. I think one of the things that where we're running into this is a project for some senior housing, and I think in that case, going to the Sierra Club, which I think is sort of the party that would need to be negotiated with, and get a waiver from them on that. That just seems like the proper process, rather than saying, well, the base reuse plan says a certain amount of density, but we can do anything we want because we have a good idea. I just think that it's better if the rules are the same for everyone. So I'm actually going to vote against the consistency determination, because I think we really just, it isn't consistent. Even though I like the greater density, and I like it that you were coming along with the community park, but it just doesn't meet the standard as far as I'm concerned. So,
well, notwithstanding the fact that the adoption and consistency determination of the general plan in 2004 made it consistent, I don't understand the argument. So rather than chew on this, let's go ahead and I'll accept the motion.
I'll make a motion that we approve the consistency.
Second.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Director Rubio?
Yes.
Director Parker? Director Adams? Absent. Director Phillips?
Yes.
Director O'Connell?
Yes.
Director Hoffa?
Yes.
Director Alexander?
Yes.
Director Gunter?
Yes.
Director Reimers,
Yes.
Director Edelin, Director Morton, Director Carbone, Director Garfield.
Yes.
Second vote on this as well. Okay, the next item is the building removal program. Mr. Brinkman, you're on again.
In front of the other ones.
What's it take to change your
Chair Rubio, members of the board, I'm going to bring this item on building removal program to the board for your consideration tonight. These are the main bullets I'll be covering in the presentation. The building removal program describing the need or how we got to today and bringing this forward to the board. Go into the cost estimate, potential financing plan, and back to staff's recommendation to the board. So the areas to talk about tonight, I've got five, probably a little hard to see, 5 circles on here, and more of a Picasso than a Degas. So these are kind of squiggly lines. I apologize for that. But we have the ammo supply point going from east to west. Ammo supply point is circled first, so that's one of the areas we're talking about. It's not; these areas all are not in the FORA CIP as part of FORA's building removal obligations. So ammo supply point on the farther east, coming in towards the west, we have circled an area in Seaside Surplus 2. These are additional 10 buildings that FORA probably cannot cover with its current building removal obligation. Right now we have a contract signed to take down 27 buildings. This is the last 10 buildings that remain. The hammerheads, they're a little more costly to take down. We have Cypress Knolls to the north. We have a Marina Community Park, a square that's in between the Surplus 2 and the Cypress Knolls. And then next to the highway, we have the MST and TAMC parcels. So we're talking about taking down the rest of these buildings as part of this potential program for building removal. So the question that the Administrative Committee has been wrestling with has been why do we study options to take down the remaining buildings? So they've been, as the administrators for the former Fort Ord, for each of the jurisdictions, looking at, it's time to develop a plan, mainly coming from Seaside and Marina. Develop a plan to take down these buildings. They're an eyesore to our community. They inhibit our base reuse within the urbanized Army footprint. They create public safety concerns. So we have these idle buildings. They may attract youth or other groups. They also have maintenance costs. We have to board up the doors and keep groups out. We also have public health issues. This is hazardous lead-based paint, asbestos, and other hazards in these buildings. We don't want people in there. There's liability issues surrounded with the buildings. So taking down these remaining buildings, we've looked at just a rough cost estimate on each of these areas. So in Seaside Surplus 2, the last 10 buildings, it cost us about $10 million is our rough estimate. And Marina Cypress Knolls, another $14 million. TAMC MST parcel next to the highway, that's a $6 million estimate. Marina City Park, $10 million. County Ammo Supply Point, $2 million. There are 9 bunkers out there. That does not include taking down the bunkers. So assuming there could be an adaptive reuse or something with the bunkers. But the overhead, $4.8 million is the estimate. So we're looking at a price tag of about $46.8 million to take down these remaining buildings. And that's about 300 buildings in that list of what remains. So looking at a potential financing plan, we've got the estimate. Looking at, well, if we're able to bond against FORA's property tax, which is going to get to our recommendation to the board in a moment, but if we're able to bond against property tax, we might be able to bond around $30 million. So that's just a rough estimate at this point. And then it still has a remaining cost. So that $31 million doesn't handle all the buildings that remain. We still have $15.8 million. So in the current FORA CIP, we have additional land sales forecasted for 2019-20. We don't have any forecasted in this fiscal year. what we do in a year from now, in fiscal year 1920. That would be $21.2 million. So if that financing plan were put together, we estimate there'd be about $5.4 million in the black. So we would be able to fund this remaining building removal. Also, just looking at if the two projects that are for development in those 5 different areas, Surplus 2 and the Marina Cypress Knolls, if those were not built based in the FORA CIP forecast for property taxes, we would collect less dollars in property taxes over the next 10 years. So whether it's FORA or the jurisdictions, tearing down these buildings can stimulate economic development, which can increase assessed value, increase how much the jurisdictions or FORA are receiving in property taxes. And just a note, in the transition EPS memo on the financial aspects, it's anticipated about 38% of the property tax would go to the county post-FORA. So the county would be receiving about 38% of property tax collections. So in terms of additional considerations, so we need to think about how can we develop a building removal program that realistically relies on land sales. We have found our track record with land sales isn't the best at predicting when a particular four-door property will sell. So part of putting together a better plan to present to the board would we be looking at land sales and increasing our ability to predict when that happens. Also, something we need to provide more information on is FORA allowed to bond post-2020? And then what are the legal and financial risks associated with the building removal program? So just knowing what are the risks, getting a full assessment and bringing that back to the board. So in terms of looking at the financing, we know that FORA property tax has been growing. It's been growing in recent years, and it's because of the development that's been happening in East Garrison, the Marina Sea Haven, Marina Dunes. We also know that FORA would need financial expertise and legal expertise to analyze the feasibility of borrowing against our property taxes. So that comes to our recommendation to the board. The question before you tonight is to authorize whether or not to authorize the executive officer to solicit and execute service contracts for a financial advisor and bond counsel to explore feasibility of bonding for a property tax to complete potentially additional base-wide building removal. And staff's available for your questions.
Questions for Mr. Harlan?
So I guess 2 questions. So assuming FORA could bond post-2020, but FORA ceases to exist in 2020, who would be responsible for these bonds? Would all of the jurisdictions that sit at this table be responsible? I have concern about that, especially because I think there are a lot of number of jurisdictions who are pretty clear they really don't want FORA to continue post-2020. And then second of all, the numbers you showed indicated that possibly there could be $5.4 million for CIP after the monies were expended for building removal. So is $5.4 million going to be sufficient to do what we need to do in the next couple of years for CIP? Thank you.
So the first question would FORA jurisdictions, or who would pay that bonding of property taxes post-2020? So there's currently in the Health and Safety Code a provision that FORA's debts would be paid for with its property taxes. Tax increment is what it states in the Health and Safety Code after FORA's dissolution. So that would be something we would ask bond counsel if we receive board authorization. We would ask them, can we bond against this revenue source? Because we're currently collecting, I think, around $3 million a year in property taxes. Can we issue bonds? And would that be an outstanding obligation, whether or not FORA is extended past 2020? And we could report that back to the board, so you would know the feasibility of using property taxes. And also, if the answer comes back no, does that mean we can't? Well, it would probably mean we could if we have permission of the other jurisdictions, since they would take on the debt post-2020. So we could bring that back to the board as well. In terms of the second question on the building removal, So I'm sorry, could you remind me of the second question? For
5.4 million, is that accurately describe how much we would have for CIP for the next 2 years, and is that going to be sufficient?
Right. So it would mean that likely if we increase our building removal costs, it would result in a fee increase. So you'd have to increase the CFD fee to offset for the building for land sales dollars that is coming out of funding the CIP.
We have an agreement that we recorded against all the properties that says that we have a formula how we assess fees if we add costs to our CIP, and this would be adding costs that have not been in the CIP. It means it impacts how fees are structured. At minimum, it means they don't go down because land sales revenue would be used to write down the fees. But it could mean that they would go up. Correct, Jonathan?
Correct.
Okay, Ms. Parker and then Ms. Parker.
Thank you. Jonathan, could you go back to your Picasso map with the circles? Or there we go. Oh, I see. Yes, I was trying to remember I didn't remember the city park as part of the dunes, but I see it now. So so if you look furthest to the west, the circle that's kind of a water bottle like this shape. If you look just to the right of it, there is a square, and that's in the dunes, right? That's the city park.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that is probably, is it across the street from the roller rink? I mean,
yes,
it's the roller rink.
So it's an NPO.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then just a question about, whether FORA can bond against future property tax. Is that, it seems to me that may be a question we need to run past, the State Department of Finance. Have we checked in with them?
Yeah, that's something that's come up at the administrative committee. That would be part of what we would look at a consultant to do. We already know from having our legal reviews of what our authorities are that the property tax stays with FORA as long as FORA is in existence. The fact that this debt issue that's specifically listed in the law says that our debts would be paid means that it would probably last past FORA, but we want to make sure we have that clear. When the Department of Finance reviewed these kinds of decisions by jurisdictions when redevelopment agencies were discontinued, Department of Finance said, no, you don't. So we would want to have some kind of review.
And redevelopment agencies had successor agencies, and the Department of Finance still said no. Mm-hmm.
Ms. Garfield.
Thank you, Chair. So if the CFD goes up, that has implications for Marina's agreement with a developer that says that they will pay the CFD that is current at the time that FORA sunsets. So that actually establishes an increase for Marina that I don't suppose would be unwelcome, but there you go. That's a consequence of this as well. The second thing is that doesn't FORA receive an incrementally larger percentage of property taxes, which makes up that current $3 million per year that we get now, and that should those property taxes then go to the jurisdictions, there would be less going to the jurisdictions property by property than are currently going to FORA.
Yeah, I would direct you to the answer to that question is rather detailed and is outlined rather specifically in the EPS report.
Okay,
that's
good to
on
know.
the web.
Thank you. And I'm assuming that this is the level of expertise that we need to answer all these questions. So, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Morton.
Yes. So Director Parker asked some of the questions. And is it feasible to get an opinion letter from the Department of Finance well in advance of spending $75,000 on bond counsel and finance counsel, because that seems that would be the biggest hurdle. And just the continuation, I do understand that the Health and Safety Code tax increment says it can be continued through bonding, but when that legislation was written, at that time when that was drafted, RDAs were in existence across the board. So there's a change, you would agree, there's a change in the basic legal assumptions when that Health and Safety Code provision was adopted. It was adopted prior to all RDAs going away. So that's why this Department of Finance letter would be,
right,
and to actually ask for an opinion letter. Going to you indicated that the county would get 38% of the tax increment if FORA went away. So under the current amount, that'd be $1.1 million that we would be needing the county to obligate if the tax increment went away to pay towards these bonds.
County would have to agree to do that, yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to know in your graph on, I can't even read, page 40 of the staff report, you have here a contemplation that this would be fully paid back, it appears, by the year 1920. You have FORA land sale proceeds in the fiscal year 1920 of $21.2 million generated in income, which would be total land sale revenues of $42.4 million. What is in the pipeline, or what has been identified as will sell in that fiscal year?
Primarily that's in City of Delray Oaks, City of Monterey, and City of Seaside.
And so Delray Oaks is indicating they're going to have a sale?
Yes.
Okay. So if in fact those sales do not go forth, what happens to the underfunding?
Right. So that would be part of developing a plan that's more concrete to bring back to the board. The issue right now would be if you're able to bond, you completed 31 million worth of work, but you still have the 15.8 left without a funding source yet. So it would be delayed most likely if land sales did not occur in that year.
So we would be paying the bond payments on the $31 million bonding, but not generating the increases in the tax increment if the land sales haven't happened and money's not being generated. How are we going to have enough money?
Right. So part of a proposed plan to bring back to the board would be comprehensive. Jurisdictions, or Seaside city manager has put out there that Seaside is willing to commit some of its land sales to this effort. So the question would be what jurisdictions could pony up, could bring to the table in terms of land sale dollars post-2020, whether or not FORA exists. That would be a plan to take care of the remaining building removal.
So that was my next question. Is FORA anticipating that the jurisdictions will continue to pay 50% of their land sale revenues post-June 2020?
Right. Post-2020, there's no requirement.
No.
No.
So in our CIP, where we have this $78 million shortfall that in the transition task force is being stated that is going to come from land sale revenues, what is that? Is that a pledge of the jurisdiction's land sale revenues? How are we completing the CIP with land sale revenues post-2020 in the transition plan?
So that's a transition question, and I believe in the transition, the question is, what are the resources that are available to pay for the costs associated with this? How is that defined in the implementation agreement? What does it say that the jurisdictions are going to pledge to pay for that? The board has not made a decision. We don't have a final legal opinion. There's been challenges back and forth, but we've asserted that the things that are in the implementation plan, and I saw what Sherry put, are obligations that continue. So we'll have to take that up under transition, but under building removal, all we're looking at in this item is the land sales revenue to 2020.
And I'm just trying to figure out if I'm double counting money. So I'm not picking a fight with you. I'm asking you.
I apologize if I seem
I'm trying
acid.
to figure out our money, that we're not double counting, number one. And then also, this would not impact FORA's ability to complete the Marina Community Partners reimbursement agreement of the $46 million.
Well,
and I know we've satisfied a portion of that. I'm just
Right.
referring to the contract.
So if this were to be taken on, we'd have to figure out how to eliminate the other agreement because the obligation is separate. We've already signed off on that. If we were to take this on, it would sort of make the other agreement null and void. We've now done the work. So Sherry mentioned that before. Jonathan, I think that's the way this is being factored in, correct?
Right. We are looking at giving FORA's current assets. What's a plan we could bring forward to the board?
So in the red line circled, you've got the park that's south of 8th Street, and I don't see the dunes in there.
Yeah,
So
phase 3 of the dunes would still continue.
That's not phase 3.
The contract would stay the same. If it were to be included, what we brought up at Administrative Committee, we could add that, but we'd have to eliminate the contract obligation that we already have in the contract.
Okay, so it's not in here. That's what I just asked previously. We're still able to fulfill our contractual obligation to Marina Community Partners if we follow this plan, because
Yes, we have, is what we
monetary,
say.
money-wise,
We have.
but we have pledges going forward when takedown happens. Thank you.
Ms. Garvey.
I'd like to make a motion.
Let me go out to the public first.
Okay, whenever.
May I have public comment?
My name is Eric Peterson, and just kind of a rhetorical question. Shouldn't we have been doing this 20 years ago? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Any other public comment? Okay, bringing it back. Ms. Garfield.
Okay. I would like to make a motion that we authorize the executive director to solicit and execute service contracts for a financial advisor and bond counsel to explore the feasibility, answering these questions, of bonding for property tax to complete remaining base-wide building removal in an amount not to exceed $75,000.
I'd like to second that with a comment, if I may.
Yes, you may.
Okay, a couple things. Number one, this board, the longer I stay on this, the more schizophrenic we get. I mean, Delray Oaks right now is looking at $20 million in land sale revenues for 360 acres out there. That's supposed to be used for the Habitat Conservation Plan. And yet we have organizations that are trying to shut down South Andrew Road, shut down the intersection and everything else. We've been told by our developers, shut that down, you're not going to have any land sales. So the money that they expect to use for habitat conservation disappears. We can't do anything to help the environment if we don't get a little bit of growth. Then we're looking at CFD, the Community Facilities District. We'd like to use that for building removal, of course. But if you look at the overall picture, the base reuse plan in 1994 was brought together. All of our organizations came together in 94 and said, what are the major capital improvement projects? Let's list them all out. In 1994, we listed all the CIPs out. That was it. Those are the things we were trying to accomplish before we sunset it in earlier now 2020. So right now, according to my calculations, a minimum of HCP, 45 million there. We still don't know where that's going to come from, number one. And number two, there are other obligations. We don't have enough money to do what's on the base reuse plan right now, and yet we want another 40 million for building removal for the CFD. I'm going to support this. I'm going to support this because I want to see what happens and see how we can get the money. So I'm not complaining about that. I will support it. But it's if we don't have the 45 million for the original base reuse plan, then we're trying to figure out we're going to get another 40 million for building removal. That's a little bit interesting. The other thing is we've all been here sitting and saying there's some of the jurisdictions that want to continue on in an organization and work together cooperatively. Others don't. Well, I'll tell you one thing right now, no matter how this comes out, Delray Oaks is not going to use their future community facilities district funds that could be used for Delray Oaks to fund other jurisdictions. If those other jurisdictions don't want to have anything to do with Delray Oaks or a cooperative effort in the future. We either come together and work together as a group where this would work, or if people are starting to say, well, we want your money, give us your CFD, and we're out of here, that ain't going to work. And I'll just tell you that right now.
I wonder if the maker of the motion and the seconder would be willing to have a friendly amendment, which would be that before we enter into a contract with someone to explore this, that the executive officer request or staff request an opinion letter from the Department of Finance to find out if they'll even contemplate this kind of action. And I know it's a busy time in Sacramento, but I would ask if Senator Monning's office or Assemblymember Stone's office could help get us a response a little more quickly than we might otherwise get it. So is that concept? Yes.
I see where you're going conceptually, but as we've seen many times over many different things, we cannot control what another office will or will not do, will or will not weigh in on. And while I think it's a really good shot to do that, I don't want to make it contingent upon that because we cannot control whether that office will comply with our request in a timely manner. So would you, a friendly reamendment, could you frame that so that it doesn't stop the process if we can't get it immediately?
Give a time frame, maybe.
Give it a good shot and move on. I don't know, but I really don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why we should spend FORA's money on something that the Department of Finance is going to say, no, you can't do it. So it's sort of like, do we want to waste money and be told no, or do we want to waste time before, or
no,
period?
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And should we get that kind of definitive response, that is absolutely a really good thing. But what if our response from that office is, well, we'll get to it in a little while, or we really want you to propose something to us and then we'll weigh in, or gee, why don't you do something first and then we'll respond. And so if we can't, I totally agree, if we could get that kind of no-go response, that is a good thing to have first. But we can't control what they're going to do.
So can I don't know, Nicole, if you want to try to weigh in on what timeframes might look like in Sacramento. I mean, the question of getting a response, especially in a busy time, it does make it very dodgy. But
yeah, I'll just note that August is the last month of a 2-year legislative cycle, so August is not looking good.
How's September looking?
So I don't know.
We're halfway through August.
Yeah.
Is everyone going to collapse September 1st? And
that's what I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get this back on track. So it sounds like you're not accepting the amendment, and there's a second. Would you consider including in the motion directing the executive officer to make the query?
I would amend it to say, and given all available efforts to get a response from that office that lets us know whether this is feasible or not from the beginning.
So,
is that acceptable, Jane?
So just to the amendment to the motion, would it be feasible just to state, let's spend the next month, our next meeting is September 28th, is to submit it tomorrow, however fast it takes tomorrow, Saturday, but that the executive director work with Senator Monning's office, our legislative representative, lobbyist, as well as Mr. Stone's office, to try to get this answer. It's critical to get it, and $75,000 is a significant amount of money, and I know this is up to, but then bring it back on September 28th. That will have some further indication, or they're just radio silent and now we can go forward. But and the reason I'm asking this is because Supervisor Parker's point is they could just shut us down, and we've spent $75,000 plus a lot more money to do all of this, and the delay of putting it into place, getting the answer from the Department of Finance, it's contemplated within this measure that this is going to take place and continue after FORA sunsets. So it's not going to be that much more of a delay in all of our interest in getting the blight down, but having a funding structure that does not render the county liable with its tax increment if it's going to come from your general fund. And you're asking all of us to obligate our general funds.
I agree. I agree that there are many things we don't know. One of the things that we need to look for is the opportunity to do things in parallel. Doing things sequentially when you have bond underwriting that needs to be done, when there's a viable organization to do it, is not inconsequential. The bond underwriting is months and months and months in the making. And so you have to find an underwriter. You've got to find your financial team. You've got to go to the open markets, and then you've got to sell the bonds. That takes months and months and months. So while I agree we have the next meeting coming up, it's not like we decide to float a bond and it gets done.
Okay. At this point, we're kind of going in circles. Would you restate your motion, please, with any additions that you might consider?
I'm going to restate the motion to say I authorize the executive director to first make every effort to, what's the name of the office again? To get a response from the California Department of Finance, the CDOF, as to the feasibility, and then to solicit and execute service contracts for a financial advisor and bond counsel to explore the feasibility of bonding for a property tax to complete remaining base-wide building removal not to exceed $75,000.
And the second is still, okay. So we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? Mr. Hopkins.
Be very quick and just say I have all of the same concerns Mayor Edelin mentioned. I'm going to support the motion. I do believe blight removal is very, very important. I think we all do. But I also think we have to think, everyone at the table, are we really looking at a relationship beyond 2020 or not? Because there's no way I'm going to put my city at liability for this kind of a cost beyond 2020 if we're going to be disappearing. So.
Okay, so let's have a vote. Pardon me? No, I don't think so. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
I'm on the fence too.
I want a timeline so that we.
So, are you abstaining or voting no? Or
just from Authority Council's point of view, these questions are really important, and they apply to building removal, but they're gonna really dig down, and we need these consultants on board to help us go forward and plan for post 2020 issues. And to have these consultants on board now is really, I think, critical.
I think I'm just going to vote no because I think we could wait until the end of September and probably have some sense of direction from Department of Finance. It's no use thinking this is going to solve all our problems if the Department of Finance says no. So I think we need that answer first. So
now we have to wait. Okay. All right. There's one no. So this we already moved.
We already voted. Yeah, we voted, and we're going to have a second vote next.
Well, I think he heard that.
That's part of the motion.
Okay, I need a motion to continue the meeting past our regular 5 o'clock.
What have we got left?
Is there a motion? Okay, then we stand.
What do we have? Habitat conservation, and it's big.
That we go to public comment and adjourn.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, public comment is now open. Okay, seeing none, we are adjourned.